main doors. Gillard will be taking questions from both the in-person and online audiences, so please do have your questions ready. I would now like to welcome Professor the Lord Aradazi of Denham to provide welcoming remarks.
Mr. President, members of council, senior academics, students, welcome and good evening. Firstly, to welcome you to the Institute of Global Health Innovation special lecture. I'm delighted to introduce our distinguished speaker, the Honourable Julia Gillard, AC, Chair of the Wellcome Trust and former Prime Minister of Australia. We are very grateful to her for coming to Imperial College London to address us all tonight. Julia has entitled her lecture 2025 and Beyond, Outlooks for Science and Global Cooperation. Global cooperation is one of those objectives everyone agrees on, but no one knows quite how to achieve. Climate change, infectious disease, and antimicrobial resistance are pivotal issues that affect us all wherever we live. But geopolitical tensions, entrenched inequality, and turbulence in the world economy make them much more challenging to resolve. Yet, cooperation for a common goal is possible. We saw this with the global response to the COVID-19 pandemic. That proved the power of science to steer us out of one of the worst global health crises in this century. At Imperial, we recognized early on the necessity of community testing to establish prevalence of the infection. That led to the groundbreaking REACT study, which monitored the spread of the virus through a finger prick testing. REACT, as we all know it here, became one of the world's biggest studies of COVID-19 infection in the community, successfully tracking the progress of the epidemic in the UK and providing unrivaled insight for the government, the public, and scientists. But science and medicine are not just there to help us through emergencies. They are hugely valuable resources with the enormous potential if we will only invest in their development. We must learn to see them for what they are, tremendous national assets, which not only enable us to lead the best lives, but which are also vital determinants of the global economy. Our universities are the powerhouses of science and medicine. This year, Imperial has launched a new strategy entitled Science for Humanity, which seeks to harness our strength in science, medicine, engineering, and business. Our aim is to develop the people and skills the world's need, strengthen research for innovation, and amplify the impact of new discoveries, inventions, and ideas. And thanks to you, that's happening every day. At IGHI, with our 7 centers of excellence across medicine, policy, technology, and design, we have grown from a small beginnings in 2010 to become a global player in the drive to confront some of the greatest health challenges in the world today. In data sciences and artificial intelligence, in clinical research and health policy, in patient safety and digital leadership, we have launched groundbreaking initiatives that are transformative of care. I recently led an independent investigation into the state of the NHS. We completed that just in 8 weeks. Its conclusions that the service is in critical conditions, but its vital signs are strong. Received wide coverage, and we are proud that it has laid the necessary groundwork for the urgently needed reforms the Labour government is to publish in the new year. Our latest project is the launch of the Fleming Initiative to tackle antimicrobial resistance. I have now made this my biggest priority, and thanks to the help of many of you in this room. We will be building a global movement to protect humanity from this growing threat. And I'm delighted to say that colleagues at CSIRO, which is Australia's national science agency, have expressed interest and support for our work, and we look forward for further collaboration. Thanks to the leadership of this amazing university, we managed to raise 100 million towards our goal, which includes building a network of centres across the world. And I'd particularly like to acknowledge the contribution of the President, but also of Alison Holmes, who's now the Director of the Fleming Initiatives. This will lead a global campaign by combining science with policy, behavioural research, and public education. None of this is possible, however, without investment. We have some of the greatest universities in the world, but investment is vital if we are to unlock their vast economic potential. They are our best hope of driving growth. As a former Prime Minister, Julia knows just how difficult balancing competing demands, global and national and local, can be. She was born in Wales and lived there as a child before moving with her family to Adelaide in Australia. She holds degrees in law and arts from the University of Melbourne, qualified as a solicitor with Slater and Gordon, a global law firm, and specialized in employment law, securing fairer treatment for workers. After 6 years as a partner at Slater and Gordon, she started her political career, moving swiftly up the ranks to become the first female Prime Minister of Australia from 2010 to 2013. As Prime Minister, she's credited with the reform of education, the development of emissions trading, and the provision and sustainability of healthcare, with a special focus on mental health. Today, as well as chairing the Wellcome Trust, she is the inaugural chair of the Global Institute of Women's Leadership at King's College. She has written 2 books and hosts a podcast on global leaders, both women and men. She is dedicated to empowering women to take up leadership positions across society. Julia, we are privileged to welcome you to Imperial this evening. As we know, in 2024, more people voted in elections than ever before in human history. Naturally, that has focused attention on the political opportunities and political threats that lie ahead. Should we be heartened or should we be wary? Should we fear for the future or are there reasons for hope? And now and how we should respond. Julia, the stage is yours. Thank you. Please welcome. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's a real privilege to join you here this evening at this fine university. I am very relieved that the backdrop behind me has changed from the photograph of me that was being shown before. We were joking about it, I have a bit of a mental block about standing next to studio shots of myself. Ever since, as a very young MP, I was out canvassing in my electorate on a rainy and windy day, standing next to an A-frame with my studio shots on it and, you know, Julia Gillard Lawler, only to have an old man come up to me and look at me, look at the photo, look at me, look at the photo, and then turn to me and say, "Taken on a good day, wasn't it, love?" So ever since then, a little bit allergic to it. Fortunately, I had a very safe seat, so I did not have to count every vote. So I called back at him, and you'd be Robert Redford, would you, mate? To which he said, no, I'm going to vote for you, don't worry. I said, well, you bloody better after that, off you go. So I'm never quite sure whether I got that vote, but very relieved that the backdrop has changed. It is great to see you on this campus, and I know that very soon it's going to become a whole lot quieter as the holiday season commences. And in the run-up, we will be wishing each other the compliments of the season and a happy new year. And as midnight strikes on December 31, many of us will mark the moment with the clink of glasses, hugs, songs, the making of New Year's resolutions, all the normal rituals. But the dawn of 2025 isn't just the start of another year. It marks the transition point from the first quarter of the 21st century to the next. Now, I'm well aware that many students on this campus were born this century. But for those of us who are a little bit older, I invite you to reflect on what you were thinking and feeling as the new millennium dawned. For me, to be frank, to date, it's not exactly playing out the way I imagined. Back then, I was a relatively newly elected MP in Australia, and I had high hopes that we would be able to take on the challenges of the new century. But it has been so much harder than I imagined. I didn't foresee the global financial crisis, nor the pandemic. I didn't have any sense of the way social media would remake our news and information environment. I expected politics to still be hard fought, but not the rise of such a tide of hyperpartisanship. And it remains astonishing to me that science has been caught in the middle of all of this change and churn. Take the vital issue of tackling climate change. In my country, introducing an emissions trading scheme to cap our generation of carbon dioxide was a policy advanced by all the parties of government in Australia in 2007. By the time I led a government which legislated such a scheme in 2012, the issue was furiously partisan, with climate denialism and fear-mongering pursued by the opposition, the Murdoch media, many in the business community, and the list went on. This led to a lost decade before the current government took some effective action, a decade of inaction that the planet couldn't afford. So today, when we see that action on climate change is not accelerating but stalling, and possibly about to go into reverse in some key parts of the world, it does strike me very strongly this is not how we imagined it. And it's not the time that I imagined when we see, for example, people rewriting the history of the COVID-19 pandemic, undermining how prepared we are for future outbreaks of infectious diseases. When we see disinformation, fragmentation, political polarisation, economic turmoil, international conflicts, heartbreaking images of loss of life. It's hard when we see all that to feel where the hope went, the hope we felt at the dawn of the new millennium. In retrospect, 2007 seems like the last year. There was huge hope and belief in liberal democracy and our capacity to collectively work together to change our world. But I'm an optimist, a believer that the turmoil of this current world is a prelude to an era of fundamental change, an era in which we will renew and renovate global institutions and democratic structures, in which we will address the fundamentals driving inequality, in which we find our way back to facts, evidence, truth, and in which we find hope in the power of science to keep us moving forwards as a species. Science that unlocks the potential to change things for the better. Science that brings people together in shared understanding of the world around us and our place in it. And for that reason, for the hope it brings, as well as the progress, we need science more than ever in the years ahead. We need researchers to be active, vocal, engaged with society's challenges, trusting and trusted by society in order to see the benefits of the invaluable contributions made here at Imperial and by scientists and partners around the world realised. Here at Imperial, you are not only preparing for the new year, you are also busy getting ready for the year 2028 to celebrate 100 years since the discovery of penicillin at St Mary's Hospital. And of course, you will be fully aware of the Australian connection with the birth of antibiotics. And just in case you aren't, let me remind you. In 1928, so the story goes, Alexander Fleming came back to the lab after his summer holidays to find a plate of bacteria had been contaminated with mould. The curious thing was that the bacteria were growing happily on the plate, except near the mould. Fleming concluded that the mould was releasing a substance that killed certain bacteria, and he named it mould broth filtrate. And then he renamed it penicillin. I think we can all be grateful for that rebranding. Of course, that's not the whole story. Fleming's lab was not the first place where the bacteria-killing potential of moulds had been noted. Mould had been used to treat infection for hundreds, if not thousands of years in cultures across the world. And Fleming was not working alone, although the story has become attached to his name. You might know that Fleming's lab stopped doing research on penicillin because they couldn't find a way to isolate it. 10 years later, a team in Oxford, led by Howard Florey, isolated it, and mass production followed, demand driven largely by World War II and met by pharmaceutical companies around the world. And only after Dorothy Hodgkin had determined the structure of penicillin did it become possible to develop stronger antibiotics that worked against a wider range of bacteria. Fleming made the scientific discovery, but he did not turn it into a solution. So while Imperial can justly claim credit for penicillin, I'm afraid you have to share, particularly with Howard Florey, a son of my home state of South Australia. Certainly, this is the version of the story I was taught in government primary school. Growing up in South Australia, Fleming was very rarely mentioned. What this history clearly shows is that science has to be international and interdisciplinary, and it's been that way for 100 years and more. It's about collaboration as well as curiosity, team science all the way. We need to remember, however, that there are many people in the world who have the potential to join team science but won't get the opportunity. I'll say more about that in a moment. But first, as we contemplate the role of science in today's world, I want to briefly set out Wellcome's perspective and strategy, given it is my role as chair of Wellcome's board, which has brought me here today. Whether for organisations or individuals, being clear on your mission is central to maximising your impact. When I was in politics, I wrote down the core purpose of the government which I led. I used to keep that sheet of paper with me at all times, moving it from handbag to handbag. On the worst days, I'd get it out and reread it as a way of steadying myself. But mostly, it was to remind me of the mission that should drive our decisions. So, what's in Wellcome's handbag? Well, in January this year, Wellcome was joined by our new Chief Executive, Jon Arne Rottigan. He looked at the organisation with fresh eyes and saw in the work we do and in our beliefs and values that Wellcome has a clear vision, a healthier future for everyone. Our part in achieving that future is our mission, supporting science to solve the urgent health challenges facing everyone. That's what we keep in the Wellcome handbag now. Science alone doesn't change the world. Wellcome has a role in providing many different forms of support that help research to have impact. Support means funding, yes, but also convening and challenging, speaking up and acting, to keep your work front and centre in decisions that impact people's health. Gone are the days, if they ever existed, when the science simply spoke for itself and would be followed by politicians reaching out to solve the challenge using the science. Now, sceptical voices, some of them powerful and influential, are raised ever more loudly to contest scientific knowledge on climate change, on vaccines, on fluoride, on pretty much everything else. That's one reason why we in the research community must engage with wider society to explain what we do, why we do it, and what it's like to work with uncertainty as well as knowledge. It can be complicated for scientists to be advocates. In mass communication, on social media, everything gets reduced to a soundbite. That's not conducive to communicating research with all of its depth and rigour. Of course, there are some who hear the soundbite and want to understand more. But when we are conveying trustworthy information and persuading people to act on it, motivating people to change something in their lives, then a clear, simple message is essential. Influence doesn't always have to come through mass media and social media. It can be quieter, more personal, through conversation and community, and in those ways it can have at least as great an impact. For example, Susty Vibes is a Nigerian organisation representing the vibrancy and passion that young people bring to the sustainability agenda. One of their focus areas is climate change and mental health. Extreme weather events and wildfires cause distress. Environmental change and prolonged exposure to pollution put people at the risk of grief and depression. For years, decades, people have felt unable to act in the face of a challenge of such a scale. Some go into denial, others into despair. In order to bring people together, share the burden, generate a critical mass of actors, and co-create agendas to guide research and action, Wellcome funded a project led from Imperial called Connecting Climate Minds. Around 1,000 people in 90 countries across research, policy, practice and lived experience have got involved in the project over the last year or so. One of them was Hope Lekwa, Head of Research and Communication at Susty Vibes, and she has spoken about inspiring change that honours the courage and meets the needs of people and communities living at the sharp end of climate change, at the sharp end of many other health challenges as well. At Wellcome, we are increasingly making explicit what might have been implicit before. We have a role in making health outcomes more equitable within and between the nations of the world. What we should not do is just improve health for the healthiest or the wealthiest. To achieve a healthier future for everyone, we must support research that will have the most benefit in the communities most affected by health challenges. And beyond that, we have seen the added benefits that come when research is done, is led from communities where the need is greatest. For example, the Ebola epidemic that started in West Africa in 2013-14, a vaccination ultimately proved decisive in containing that virus. Although it was a tragedy that the vaccine had not been taken through clinical trials before the outbreak, and that's because demand was low and came from countries that would not be able to afford to buy it. The research that was done with the affected communities during the epidemic not only evaluated the vaccine, finding it to be 100% effective, it also allowed the study of innovative vaccine designs, and not in a theoretical way, but in the specific contexts of Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. When research is shaped by the needs of the communities around it, then it has a head start towards application and implementation. So Wellcome's funding for research in low and middle income countries has been increasing. Actually, our funding for research in the UK has also been increasing, thanks to the strong performance of our financial investments over the past 10 to 20 years. And our funding models are evolving. Alongside excellent research programs in Kenya, Malawi, South Africa, Thailand and Vietnam, we are now funding organisations like the Science for Africa Foundation and the India Alliance, organisations who are then empowered to use that money to run their own grant schemes designed for researchers working in their local or regional context. We're not the first to take such approaches, not by any means, and to achieve equity in health and medical outcomes, we will need to keep evolving. Yesterday, I got back from Kenya, widely recognised now as a scientific power in Africa and increasingly in the world. This visit, and one I made earlier this year to Malawi, reinforced for me the undeniable truth that human capacity for research excellence exists everywhere, that it is equitably distributed. What must match it is an equitable distribution of research opportunity. Our aim must be an era of inclusive excellence. I've spoken a lot about health challenges facing the world and the role of research in solving them. At Wellcome, we sometimes struggle to fully convey our wholehearted commitment to the other side of the scientific coin, which is open-ended exploratory research with no application in mind. Again, when Jon Arne joined us as our CEO, he looked at our strategy and again, without changing what's in it, he made it clearer and fresher. So we now say that Wellcome works in two distinct but complementary modes, discovery and solutions. Solutions, as I've described in the context of climate and health, is about supporting science to have real global impact to protect and improve people's health. Not only what research Wellcome can fund to make progress on the issue, but also how we can make sure research reaches decision makers and informs action on climate change. In solutions mode, we set our goals in partnership with others, but specifying what Wellcome is best placed to deliver, and we combine the most relevant activities to achieve them, funding advocacy, campaigning, convening researchers and policymakers, bridging gaps that stop or slow actions down. The flip side is discovery mode, which is how we support researchers across the spectrum from biology to medicine, history to innovation, to ask questions that could take them to new areas, new insights in life, health and well-being. Sometimes we do this through targeted interventions in a particular field, such as establishing the Wellcome Sanger Institute in 1993 to help sequence the Human Genome Project, or more recently, bringing researchers and technologists together to remove technical and access issues that were limiting the use of cryo-electron microscopy. In our discovery research funding schemes, it is really up to you, the researcher, to bring your agenda to Wellcome. It doesn't have to be related to a health challenge or a medical condition. In fact, we're looking for ideas that push at the boundaries of knowledge and open up new fields of inquiry that will lay the groundwork for research in the next quarter of a century and beyond. I'll share with you an example and show how discovery and solutions interact over the long term. Wellcome was founded in 1936, and one of our first trustees and one of my predecessors as chair was Sir Henry Hallett-Dale, an eminent British scientist. Coincidentally, in the same year, Dale shared the 1936 Nobel Prize for Physiology or Medicine for studies on how nerve signals are transmitted to muscles and the interaction with the receptor proteins. Dale's work helped distinguish two different types of receptors. This year, a new therapy option for schizophrenia was approved, called Cobenfy, It uses the first new pharmacological approach in schizophrenia for 50 years based on one of the receptors Dale described. Of course, much more research by many other researchers was needed to get from that discovery in 1936 to this new solution. The path was not linear, and for most of the time it was not aiming to target schizophrenia. Even if it had been, there would have been no guarantee it was going to get there. Not only does this story speak to the urgent need for innovation in mental health work today, it also shows the invaluable role of fundamental research in any and all disciplines relevant to health to open up new fields and new opportunities for advancing healthcare in the future. I'm sure that new discoveries made at Imperial this year or next will go on to have health benefits as significant as penicillin, as any of the things that have been discovered over time. That's why, in our discovery mode, Wellcome strives to give researchers opportunities to pursue what's important to them, to follow their curiosity, because discoveries, by their very nature, cannot be planned. And that brings us back to the discovery of penicillin, the era of antibiotics, and the sad fact that where once it was thought to herald the end of infectious diseases, almost as soon as it was introduced, bacteria began showing resistance. Today, drug-resistant infections are spreading, neutralising antibiotics and giving old infections a chance to rise again. 5 million people die each year from drug-resistant infections, more than malaria and HIV/AIDS. The world has to come together and chart a course, and it is. 2 months ago, a high-level meeting on antimicrobial resistance at the UN General Assembly agreed to set targets for the global AMR response, including a 10% reduction in lives lost to AMR by 2030. A good result, even if the target could have been more ambitious. But let's be realistic as well as optimistic. This is going to be a protracted global campaign. COVID-19 showed how infectious disease responses that ought to be global can fragment into nationalism and populism. How any kind of global COVID vaccination strategy was undone by wealthy nations, putting their own populations first and leaving lower income countries at the back of the queue. Of course, it's not easy to persuade a government to invest in benefits for other countries before their own. It's not easy to convince a government to invest in preventative actions either. You spend a lot to see nothing happen. Although, of course, that nothing is the lives not lost and the economic dislocations avoided. The same is true of climate change. In terms of health, it's like a pandemic in slow motion. But the change to the world will be permanent this time, and even as people's health is already being impacted, we still don't know exactly what it means for our health now and into the future. The role of research here is to generate evidence to inform policy decisions about how to stop further climate change and how to adapt in ways that sustain health for everyone. More than that, we also have to work to ensure that the evidence we have is used, not left on a shelf or made inaccessible to the people who need it most. We have to advocate for change and be prepared to step into the public square even when it's uncomfortable. In addition to advocacy, Wellcome has found a role in these situations as a convener, and we are exploring how to do this more in the future by bringing together people across science, culture, politics, philanthropy, business and civil society at a global level. This is essential because health overlaps the private sector, charities, governments and global institutions. The story I told you about the schizophrenia drug, Cobenfy, demonstrates how these different sectors have to play their part to demonstrate new ways to improve health. Around 10 years ago, Wellcome made social investments in the company that developed Cobenfy. These investments effectively paid for the phase 1 and 2 clinical trials, showing that this new approach had potential. But it's not Wellcome's role to finance later stages of development for what will be a commercial product, let alone get involved in licensing and marketing. The private sector has to do that. New mental health treatments haven't been a high priority for pharmaceutical companies over recent years, but Cobenfy's company was bought by Bristol Myers Squibb in March this year, and they completed phase 3 trials and took it through to FDA approval. This is a good sign. It shows renewed interest for commercial investments in neuropsychiatry and mental health innovations. This is a message Wellcome is trying to amplify. We've seen and often funded amazing science in neuroscience and mental health, and we really do believe that there is a wave of opportunities coming. But they won't help anyone without private sector involvement and financing. Equally, such advances need healthcare providers and governments to be aware of these opportunities and innovations and to create demand for them that will make investors more confident to put their money in. And there have to be pathways in the global health architecture to make these new treatments available to the poorest communities in the world, comparable to the vision of vaccine access pursued by the Global Vaccine Alliance, Gavi. One of my most inspiring engagements this year was co-convening in New York a meeting with United Nations Deputy Secretary Amina Mohammed, which was attended by those who work at the front line in humanitarian settings. Our mission with them is to work out how mental health innovations can work to assist communities when life is at its hardest because of conflict, natural disasters, forced displacement, and other catastrophes. While many around the world share our drive to improve the health of all humanity, we cannot be naive about the challenges to our views. We meet tonight in the shadow of the recent US election. It squarely raises for us the pressing question of how do we work with governments whose aims and values are not in line with ours, not in line with scientific evidence, not in line with cooperative and collaborative approach, particularly the cooperative and collaborative approach that research embodies. The short answer is that we have to work with the people who have been elected, those in power, those with the most influential voices in the public discourse. If we don't try to engage, we've already failed. After inauguration in January next year, President Trump will be back at the centre of geopolitics. And from decisions and statements already reported, there are grounds to be concerned about the global architecture for health. To keep the US and other nations where politics is following the same kind of cycle engaged with global health, we will need a change of rhetoric to talk less about people's health and more about national health security, protecting the public, getting value for money. To talk more about the geopolitical loss of status and influence if the US were to pull back from the international treaties and obligations, noting the gaps created may well be filled by other nations. It would seem hard for President Trump to accept being a less important, less influential voice in the world. Of course, Wellcome is strictly non-partisan, and we will continue to work with all governments around the world. At the same time, because of our independence, we are well placed to raise our voice, loudly if necessary, for science, the hope it brings, and the way in which the world can work together to solve the urgent health challenges facing everyone. Let me conclude where I started. We are moving into the second quarter of this century. What happens in these years will be pivotal for the rest of the century and all the time that lies beyond. Right now, I know it's easy to look at the world and despair, or look at the world and turn inwards. It's easy to feel exhausted, disillusioned. But I genuinely believe that there is cause for hope. Science gives us hope. The human capacity for innovation gives us hope. And it's hope partnered with hard work that will take us from this era of turmoil into a better future. I thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Julia. That was a wonderful talk, wide-ranging, covered a huge amount of ground, full of ideas, and I'm sure it's going to provoke lots of questions, which is what we have time for now. My name's Jeremy Lawrence. I'm going to chair this session. We've got a couple of roving mics, I think, somewhere.
When Donald Trump comes in and...
hang on, if you wouldn't mind.
How would you react to that?
Sorry, if we just take it.
Sorry, I thought I had the floor.
Okay. No, not just yet, if you don't mind.
I'm from New Zealand, don't worry.
Yeah, okay.
I apologise.
And we've got a couple of roving mics, and we'll take questions from you. And we also have some questions coming online, I hope, from our people viewing online. So we invite that. But I'm going to start with the first question. I think it's the first thing I wanted to say, I was fascinated by the story about Cobenfy and how the gap between the discovery of the receptor and its application. I mean, that is a long bet.
It's a long bet.
But I'm sorry, that's not the question I want to ask. I was just fascinated. The question I want to ask is a rather more serious one about the hostility towards science. Now, you started your talk by talking about the importance of science, the value of science, and how tough it is when science becomes a subject of political dispute, as you found in your negotiations over emissions trading, which you referred to. At the end of your talk, you then referred to the alarm we all feel at President Trump's imminent arrival back in the White House, and how that could trigger more political dispute over science. There was a piece published, an article in the Financial Times this week with the headline, "The Republican War on Science," reviewing the nominations that President Trump has already made to health and elsewhere. And more generally, there is a sense of an anti-elite, anti-expert, anti-science movement. How do we understand this, and how do we respond to politicians and people who are hostile to science?
That's a great question, and I wish I had the short, snappy, easy answer. But if there was a short, snappy, easy answer, I think we would have found it by now. I think we can't be naive about how manipulated all of this is, and that there, are those, of course, who become active around scientific causes, who genuinely believe what they've been told. I'm thinking, for example, of people who campaign against vaccinations, and they have genuinely come to believe stuff that they've read online about the adverse effects of vaccinations on children. So there are definitely people who are genuine about the cause that they're supporting, and you would hope that ultimately exchange, discussion might enable people to change their minds. But there is a category of this where people really aren't mistaken about science, but commercial and other interests are driving them to cast doubt on the science. We're familiar over the course of last century with the many, many things that big tobacco did to cast doubt on the science about how bad smoking was for your health, simply to maintain market share and commercial advantage. And I think we have seen a lot of that around climate science, that it's in the interests of a lot of big money interests, big oil and others, to put doubt on the science. And so, you know, I think we've got to be smart enough to realise this is an asymmetric fight where we are here, or scientists are here, trying to put the rational, even-tempered case, and the people who are getting all of the attention are putting the irrational, flamboyant, snapshot, TikTok case, and it's like we're on two different planes. And so I don't think we should, you know, pursue them down those campaigning tactics. I am a believer in the Michelle Obama adage, when they go low, we go high. But I do think that we need to get much more savvy about the storytelling and these campaign tools. And until we do that, I think, you know, the things that they generate and say will get far more attention. I mean, to give you one recent example, I mean, I'm not suggesting this became mainstream or was believed by millions of people, but there was clearly a range of Americans that thought that somehow President Biden and the US scientific establishment had the ability to generate the hurricane, and that was done to stop Republican voting communities from getting to the polls in Florida. Now, if only we had the ability to turn the weather on and off like that. I mean, obviously we don't, but I suspect that, and we should be clear that there's a very serious side to this. Some meteorologists were starting to experience threats of violence and needed to get protection in their homes and things like that. So it's got a serious side. But I suspect that the scientific campaign to explain that it's not possible to whip up a hurricane on demand was nowhere near as easy to access or understand as the fear-mongering of the people who were pursuing that campaign. And we've got to try and equalise that.
Could there be a Wellcome-funded research project in how to counter this sort of thing?
Well, I think there's, you know, there's plenty of studies about, you know, counter-radicalisation, countering extremism, and this is a different form of it. A lot of that was done in the face of, you know, violent extremism and terrorism events. So there is a body of research work here, but I think we just have to get smarter and smarter about the terrain on which we're engaged in the debate and the tools that work best on that terrain. And I know that's very uncomfortable for a lot of institutions, a lot of individual scientists, but you know, I do think for science in the future, that's going to have to be a skill set in the way that the skills you deploy in the laboratory are a needed skill set.
Okay, thank you. We wait to see how things develop in the White House and beyond. Questions, please. There's one here, yes. And have we got some more? Yes, over there too, please.
Hi, thanks Julia. A fellow expat, Jane Hurst. I'm a professor of global women's health here at Imperial College. The question I have is, you know, thank you for, I guess, painting a fairly, hopefully optimistic picture for the next quarter century, but one issue which I think has not been spoken about tonight is the issue around women's rights and reproductive rights for women. And I just wonder, in your position, I know you're a great champion for women's leadership, but in your role in the Wellcome Trust, I'm just wondering how you see Wellcomes that can support women and girls around the world, and improving their health and their livelihoods. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Can we take just a couple?
Sure,
Is that
sure.
all right? Could we have that? Your question? Yes, thank you.
Hello, thank you so much for that wonderful talk. I just wanted to ask, how could students contribute to this global movement? As someone who's studying at university, like, is there anything that we could do that could contribute to the upcoming events and science? Thank you.
Yep.
I think we'll stick with that, yes, yes.
Okay, well, I'm going to actually connect those two questions because I think that young people, history shows that young people campaigning can make an enormous difference to public policy and to the future course of history. I'm not old enough to have been the generation that marched around the Vietnam War, and in Australia there was conscription to send young Australians to the Vietnam War, so it was a dramatic and deep cause in Australia. And there is no doubt that the youth mobilisation at that time changed the course of Australian politics, helped lead to the election of the Whitlam government, and the Whitlam government not only brought the troops home from Vietnam, it established many of the institutions, including the platforms for learning, that still serve Australia and its young people today. So, young people getting mobilised really matters. And I think there is no shortage of causes, one of which, of course, is the cause of gender equality and women's reproductive rights. As Wellcome, in terms of our mission, we are not investing, there may be things in the discovery research stream that have got implications, but we're not investing directly in reproductive rights, but more with the hat on that I wear as chair of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership. I'm obviously hugely concerned that part of the partisanship, the right-wing partisanship, some would call it populism, that is taking political ground around the world, that there are threads of that all tend to go together. These movements tend to be anti-action on climate change, anti-global engagement, Make America Great Again, or various iterations of look after your own country first, anti-immigration, and the other hallmark tends to be anti-women's rights. For example, in Hungary, we've seen action taken against universities that wanted to offer gender studies and those sorts of things. So, this comes together in a package, and confining women's roles and women's choices, as well as othering people who come from different parts of the world, comes together in this discriminatory package. And so it's very important that we are campaigning on all of those issues, each of them important in their own right, and each of them connected to changing the tide of politics.
Okay, thank you. More questions? One there, yes. Just at the back in the white jacket. And is the one up there? I can't see in the light. Right up there, yes. Thank you. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you very much for your inspiring lecture. I'm Kevin, I'm a medic, and I was the first Indonesian youth delegate to WHO, currently the Vice President of Equity, Diversity and Inclusion at Imperial Business School, pursuing global health management. As you said, during COVID-19, we all see that the vaccine inequities as a prominent issue, especially when the vaccine producers who comes from the high-income countries kind of hoarded all of those vaccines. And at the same time, the pandemic prevention preparedness reductions effort to produce basically the pandemic accord in Geneva currently is stalling. I was there during the INP10, and there were so many factions and with competing interests and so on. And the latest INP11 a couple of months ago hasn't finalized any agreement yet. From your personal experience, what kind of global health policy and diplomacy changes that need and to basically necessary to tackle this in the near future? Because pandemic it could be in the next 5 years I don't want to sound very bleak,
Yeah,
but it could be. And I would like to ask that. Thank you.
Did you got that?
Okay, yeah, I've got that.
Vaccine hoarding. And there was one over here. Yes, right at the top there, please.
Yeah.
Miss Gillard, Sophie Ellsworth, journalist at News Corp Australia. Your former colleague Kevin Rudd, now US Ambassador, Australia's US Ambassador, he has criticised Mr Trump. He's said on platform X, he's the most destructive president in history, he's a traitor to the West. He's removed those posts. What's your view on this, and is it appropriate that he remains in that role as Australia's ambassador to the US? Thank you.
Do you want to take that? This is about welcome and your speech. I don't think you must feel compelled.
Thank you, thank you.
Let's have, is there someone else? Yes, right at the back there.
Thank you very much for the talk. I'm also an Australian.
Could you give your name and your affiliation?
Yeah, so I'm I'm a first-year PhD student in the Department of Physics working on climate. So my questions are about sort of like air pollution, which obviously has an impact on human health. Is there a need for, I guess, like more collaboration between existing government departments of, for example, environment and health, which tend to be relatively disparate disciplines in terms of tackling, I guess, like climate-driven health emergencies like that?
Are you okay? Yeah.
Yeah, let me try and answer those questions. On pandemic preparedness, I agree with you. We are nowhere near where we should be. And, you know, of the things that I thought might come out of the pandemic, when we were in the grips of the pandemic, I thought what might come out of it was a new respect for science, because, you know, clearly science found the way to get us out of the pandemic. Instead, we're, you know, in a lot of contest around the world around vaccines and other things. I thought what might come out of the pandemic was a re-evaluation of the importance of caring work, because which, let's face it, in most societies is still predominantly women's work, because I thought the penny might drop that when, you know, push came to shove and it was really hard, you know, the people we were relying on were doctors, nurses, caring workers, not, you know, bankers, bond traders, people like that, that might have caused some evaluation in people's minds about how we look at various professions and indeed how we reward them. And I thought we would learn the lessons and we would be raring to go to get ourselves in the best position to address a future pandemic. None of those things have proved to be true. And it actually worries me that the thing that's come out of it more than anything else is an erosion of public trust. And there's certainly a lively discourse now around whether, if we were faced with another pandemic tomorrow and governments issued stay-at-home orders, whether we would get the same degree of compliance that we got in the initial stages of the COVID-19 pandemic, where overwhelmingly communities were very prepared to accept government advice and do what they were asked. How are we going to move from where we are now to where we need to get to? I don't know, and we don't have all the data points we need yet. We don't know whether Robert Kennedy will be confirmed in the health position in the US. If he is, we don't know whether his anti-vaccine rhetoric will move from rhetoric into action in US domestic policy. We don't know whether there will be an attempt to put it into action in global policy, for example, no longer supporting the Global Vaccine Alliance. We don't know for sure whether the US will continue to be involved in the WHO or whether it will seek to withdraw from that space, and the list goes on. What I think we can certainly say to the US is geopolitics abhors a vacuum, and if you leave one, someone will fill it. and they might want to think about the geopolitical consequences of others filling those vacuums. But there's a lot to work through before, hopefully, we re-steady the international architecture around all of the things that we need to do to get ready to fight what will inevitably be in human history. We don't know when, but inevitably there will be another pandemic at some point. On your question at the back, I know from my own experience in government that there's nothing harder than getting governments to work across silos and often across levels of government. And in Australia, you know, to line all of that up, you need the federal government, state governments, they're often, depending on the issue, local governments might have a role. So it gets really complicated. But I agree that in the same way, in this era of science, we are seeing far more come out of multidisciplinary teams, the mobilisation of different skills. You know, government in its working needs to definitely get better at taking that approach. Otherwise, we are going to end up too siloed, and the problems that we've got to solve today are inherently multidisciplinary problems. And just from an abundance of caution in terms of the Australian news cycle, let me just say, Australia picks its ambassadors. It's picked Kevin Rudd, who's doing a very good job for our country in the United States.
Very good. Just on the pandemic, your remarks are prescient because I don't know whether you've seen, there's a report today about bird flu in North America, 55 human cases, all associated with poultry farms. But David Kessler, the former chief scientist, saying, my concern is growing. So yes, it's urgent. Right, more questions. Just one there. And is the one, yes, just.
Yeah, we've got a couple online as well.
Okay, let's take that one there, can we?
Okay.
Just in the front here, yes, yes. Sorry, go ahead.
Hi, Julia. Thank you for your lecture. My name's Vicky Matsis. I'm a Sir Henry Dale Fellow here at Imperial College. I'm a developmental biologist, definitely in the discovery science. Thank you for funding discovery science. I guess I'm curious, as a scientist, what you think we could do to improve public perception that we're not currently doing. So is it about opening up our doors more, letting people in, seeing what we do? You know, we go out to schools, we do those things, but we do bury our heads. We are writing grants, we are trying to make discoveries, but we do want to bring people with us. You emphasize team science, and it's something we try to do, but I was curious if there's something else there that you think we should be connecting with or trying to do to enrich the discoveries that we're making and keep the public with us.
Yeah. Okay, and there's one over here.
Thank you for the talk. My question is about something that was mentioned earlier about why people may view science as elitist. I'm a science student myself, and I know that without wanting to sound too pessimistic, the scientific community can also have problems with elitism, racism, misogyny, and other problems. So do you think there has to be more of a focus on improving these things within the scientific community so that people aren't turned away from it and led to distrust it?
Okay, let me take both of those questions. One of the things you learn in politics, which I think has got application for how we better sell science to the community, one of the things you learn in politics is the thing that you spend all of your waking hours completely obsessed by, most people don't care at all. And so you are completely transfixed about who said what to who in question time. Most people don't even know who those people are. I remember, you know, we had John Howard as Prime Minister of Australia for a long period of time, and from 1996 to 2007. And there was research even late in his career as Prime Minister, and this is not a criticism of him, this is just, you know, the evidence. Even late in his career, there were a significant percentage of Australians who, when called upon to do so, could not name the Prime Minister, even though the same bloke had been in the job for a decade. And let's face it, he didn't have the world's most complex name. So, you know, most people don't care at all. And we, I think, in our communications often start up here and people don't know about the stuff here. I was talking to someone around 2 weeks ago about polling research, qualitative research, when they get people talking about issues. So they'd got a group of voters talking about research, and initially, when asked, people thought research in university was something that undergraduates did between lectures. Like, honestly. You know, well, universities do research. Oh yeah, I guess those kids, when they're not in lectures, they're like researching stuff. So, you know, we haven't even explained that. The way in which research happens in universities, happens in institutions, and if you haven't put those pieces in people's minds, then it's sort of harder to build on it and layer it up ever more complex. So I think the more open we can be, the more inclusive we can be. And I know it takes time and it takes resources and all the rest of it, but it is incredibly important that we get better public engagement with what science and research really is and how it really happens and who really does it. And one thing that, you know, I'm not a scientist, and one thing that I've been incredibly impressed about when I go and meet with young scientists in places that welcome funds is I always say, I last studied science when I was in high school, and that was, you know, a hell of a long time ago. And there they are with their presentation, and then you can see them recalibrating, and they say something like, "You do know what a cell is, don't you?" I'm like, "Yeah, I reckon I've got that, yeah." And then they, you know, sort of build it up for me. And when you get them to start really from that, you know, sort of most basic bit up, they're hugely persuasive. And even someone with, you know, sort of next to no science really can follow it and be amazed by it. So, you know, because you're doing it all day, every day, in some senses you might no longer feel the sense of wonder that it can inspire when you come to it fresh. So I think there's a lot to do there. Then I absolutely agree with you. Science, you know, the culture around science, the telling of the history of science, and I alluded to this in my speech, has often been the history of the eccentric male genius scientist who was a difficult human being to get along with, who would frequently yell or do other wholly inappropriate things, but that all doesn't matter because he's curing cancer. So, you know, doesn't matter if there's misogyny, doesn't matter if there's racism, because this is the bloke that's going to cure cancer or whatever. I don't think that's the truthful, I don't think actually that's how scientific discoveries best are made. I think the truth of most science is that it's taken a huge team to get it done. The story of penicillin is one example of that. It's not about one hero man. And because it takes a huge team to get it done, teamwork skills, respect for human beings, multidisciplinary skills, diversity, inclusion, these are all as core to science today as the actual scientific knowledge and scientific method. And certainly at Wellcome, in our funding and grant structure, we are putting increasing emphasis on research culture and on equity, diversity and inclusion. And I think we are nice human beings, but we don't do that because we're nice human beings. We do that because in our minds it's unambiguous that if you want excellence, then inclusion is the best way to excellence.
I think that's a good guide to anyone who's putting forward a new research proposal to Wellcome. We have a couple of questions online.
Thank you. So we've got a question from Harsh Priya, who's a Master's in Public Health student at Imperial. And they have asked, what are your thoughts on a focus on equity and integrated care models, moving away from core research to a more community participatory research methods?
This is, something we're very focused on. We're focused, for example, in our mental health solutions stream on relying on the advice and wisdom of people with lived experience. In our work globally, particularly in the research institutions we fund in many parts of the world, Malawi is a great example of that. We're very focused on how research and community come together, and I've seen with my own eyes the way in which the local community is integrated into things like trialling, innovations that are coming from the research centre which address local community health needs, including things like malaria and tuberculosis. We know, I don't think it was ever really true to say you have the, complete town gown distinction and you have the scientists in their white coats over here and the communities over there and the two never mix. I don't think that was ever, 100% true, but to the extent that it was ever true at all, we've got to be much more bringing together of the people whose lives are impacted by health challenges now and the scientists who are working on those health challenges.
Okay, more questions? One there. The end, yeah. And have we got one on this side? Yes, there is someone with white hair, forgive me, pointing that out. I'm just about able to make out against the light.
George Gunning, Professor here. Why do you think there's a relative lack of MPs with science background? So in the UK, it's about 20%, I guess. What is it that seems to be stopping scientists going into political careers where maybe we could have the influence that you've been talking about so thoroughly today?
And yes, at the back there.
Yeah, I'm the guy with white hair. Otherwise known as Andrew Dillon. And thanks for a really lovely talk. And I was really interested in your comments about antimicrobial resistance. And it strikes me that there may be some parallels in the challenge of dealing with AMR and the challenge that we have come familiar with in dealing with climate change. There's a huge change that we all need to make as individuals in terms of our expectations about the treatment we get when we've got infections. There's a clinical and a vet community for whom antimicrobials and the use of them have become very familiar, perhaps too familiar in some circumstances. And there's a massive industry in the pharmaceutical industry that develops drugs, and the food industry that's a huge consumer of antimicrobials. So there's a massive change that isn't going to be dealt with by sort of a single approach to a single community or a single technology. And I just wondered if there was anything in your experience as a politician in handling the climate change challenge in Australia that you think will be a useful read across to everybody who's involved in antimicrobial resistance.
Okay, I'd start with the politicians in science first. I certainly would encourage people coming from a scientific background to look at politics and go into politics. I suspect that the career pathways for many scientists, particularly young scientists, because you're always working for the next grant and that kind of thing, it's sort of so heads down that it's hard to do the outwards engagement that readying yourself for a career in politics requires. But I do think, trying to get more scientists in would be great. I think we're hugely advantaged at this time here in the UK to have Patrick Vallance serving as Minister for Science. and I have been meeting with a number of the new MPs from all political parties, but a number of the new MPs from the election or recent MPs. And there are a number who either are scientists or have already self-identified as very interested in science, or their constituencies have significant scientific establishments. And I think if we, work across all of that, then you can create a core in the Parliament that is really interested in these issues. On how we sort of do the community campaigning and engagement around AMR, once again, this is such a complex question. I don't, pretend to have the answer, but I do think that there is potentially some opportunities in this era. I think, the traditional model of medicine, the one that, I grew up with, really the model was, you waited till something was wrong, and then you took your broken body down to the doctor shop and the doctor got you a pill, and then we're all good. Or possibly not, but near enough. Whereas now, with this sort of huge wellness industry, with the wearable tech, all of it, I think there's much more of a sense in the community that health and well-being are not about waiting till something's wrong. Health and well-being are about taking active steps to manage your own health, to do the preventative measures. I think we have been, pretty good as a society at getting, routine screening tests, breast screening, bowel screening, getting community cultures around doing all of those things, because people get it that, the earlier a problem is found, the more likely they are to do well. And I think we can, that sort of sense of partnership in health, that we can use that sense and build on it in the campaigning around AMR and be explaining why, from the point of view of individuals as well as from the point of view of the planet, and the future of infectious diseases and their prevention. We need to be partners in this. And there is, quite an intersection in terms of the food system with the climate change debate. So, once again, I think we can hopefully integrate some of the messaging around, food, where our food comes from, how our food gets to us, how carbon intensive it is, how much water is embedded in it, and also how antibiotics have been used in the food system and misused in the food system in a way that is going to undermine human health and animal health for the future. So I think that there are some things potentially coming together which give us opportunities.
Okay. Yes. There's a question here. And is there one over here? There's one there. Yep. Just there, yeah. Go ahead.
Thank you for the talk. My name is Gloria and I'm a 13-year-old student here. A few hours ago, my school informed us about the new law in Australia regarding social media. And I was just wondering, since you highlighted in your lecture how important it is that young people are curious and want to help the world as we head into this new part of the century, what is your opinion on this law? Thank you.
Sure.
And one here.
Thank you so much. My name is Tao. I'm a researcher in human-computer interaction from the Dyson School of Design Engineering. We do a lot of research from the human factors perspective. But my question is related to the point that I really appreciate you mentioned a lot of research collaboration. But I wanted to know your vision and how do you think, and also the Wellcome Trust vision in terms of collaboration between the mainstream Western research power and also Eastern research power, for example, China. As a Chinese researcher, sometimes I feel anxious whenever if I mention some research to do with China, and then because the political and geopolitical conflict. So I wanted to know what's the strategy on the region ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So starting with social media, yes, there's new laws emerging in Australia to restrict access to social media for young people, for teenagers. And I am a supporter of that. I think that there are other ways that young people can express political activism, navigate their way to good information. I think the downsides of social media for young people, whilst, you know, the research base is not as deep as we might want. One of the reasons that it's not as deep as we might want is it's pretty hard to get a sort of randomised control trial, because then you'd have to get a group of kids off social media. But I think the evidence, in my view, is already clear enough about mental health implications from the feminist perspective, about access to pornographic, sexualised content, the exchange of such content between school-aged children, and body shape issues, anorexia, suicide, people being social media content around how to take your life. I think all of these things are there, and it can be a very pernicious mix for young people in particular. And I think this, at its core, is a collective action problem, because if I want to keep my kid off social media, that is almost impossible to do if every child in their peer group is on social media. And many of the other parents, and maybe even some of the kids, would prefer to be off it. But if everybody else is on it, then you've sort of put yourself into social isolation. So it is the classic definition of a collective action problem. And I think the potential of these new laws is to create a new norm which enables that collective action problem to be resolved. And so I am very supportive of it. On global outlooks for science, I mean, we at Wellcome obviously believe that science is truly global and that there is wonderful research of merit happening right around the world. We do have to make decisions about where we fund and where we can't fund. And the decision we've made is we obviously, the UK is our place of birth and our home. We're headquartered here. So we fund science in the UK. We fund science in low-income countries, lower middle-income countries. There are some calls that go out where we're genuinely looking for the best science from anywhere in the world. And that does mean that we have a perspective about science in Asia. We have on our board of governors a noted Hong Kong-based scientist called Gabriel Leung. So he is able to very much bring to our board discussions, perspectives about science in China, science in Asia. So, that's the way we work. I do fear, though, that as part of the current geopolitics, which is so much about trade wars and the exchanging of ugly words between the US and China, that links in and around science can also suffer from that. And so that geopolitical problem does have implications for science, and we're going to have to respond very carefully as we see exactly what happens under the Trump administration.
Well, that's a suitably broad sweep on which to end, I think, because I'm afraid we're out of time. Professor Hugh Brady is going to say a few words in a moment, but it just remains me to thank you very much for coming to Imperial to deliver this lecture, and also for handling the questions that have been fired at you so adroitly and so entertainingly. And also thank you, all of you, for those stimulating, provocative questions. So please give yourselves a round of applause.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julia. I'm very conscious of the fact that I am the last thing standing between all of you who are here in person and refreshments. So it is traditional for me to pick up on a number of points in your lecture. I will be mercifully brief, I guarantee you that. Thank you for reminding us of the penicillin story, for reminding us of the challenge of AMR, and for your kind words about the Fleming Initiative, an absolute priority for Imperial. As Ara said, we launched our strategy for Imperial Science for Humanity in March of this year, and one of the major focuses of that is on convergent science, so team science at real scale. And I think no better example in Imperial than the Fleming Initiative, which sees us not only bringing together the best and brightest minds in life sciences, biomedicine and population health, but the interface between those disciplines and mathematical data science, AI, and machine learning, and very importantly, public engagement and engagement with policymakers. So thank you for that. Thank you for also stressing the importance of transnational collaboration if we are to solve the major challenges facing humanity on our planet. This is again something highlighted in our strategy. It's very dear to our community. We saw the benefits of it writ large even 2 weeks ago when we opened our hub I mentioned in Ghana, which already sees us through that base, including the really brightest minds from West Africa, with Imperial researchers, with researchers in Malaysia, in Brazil, and India as part of the Wendy and Eric Schmidt AI for Science Fellows Program. So again, I think just like to commend you for those words. Finally, thank you for your optimism. These are difficult times, as has come across, and we should recognize those. But if anything, I think they should strengthen our resolve. Institutions such as Imperial and Wellcome must work together to be heard and to make sure that the power of science is heard worldwide. It is not something we can back off. There's too much at stake. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for joining us, to those of you in person, to the almost equal number who've joined us online. Thank you to Ara, David, and our colleagues from IGHI and the entire team for putting together this fantastic event. And ladies and gentlemen, one last round of applause for our guest speaker, Julia Gillard.